gala with the Roundhouse Foundation in Sisters, Oregon. Just 0.4% of philanthropic dollars go to Native American programs and projects in the United States. That number has always stuck with me because it represents such a huge blind spot and truly a missed opportunity for philanthropy. My guest today is Stone Hudson. He's a citizen of the 3 affiliated tribes, Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara of the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota. He's a program officer at Meyer Memorial Trust, where he oversees the Tribal Nations Partnership Initiative. Before that, he worked for Oregon Congressman Earl Blumenauer and for the City of Portland's Office of Government and Tribal Relations. Stone has had a really interesting career before coming into the philanthropic world, and he brings a sense of service and curiosity to his work that is absolutely magnetic. He knows how to show up as his whole self and bring people together in the process. He's a bridge builder. Stone and I have known each other for the last several years. Recently, he and Tracy Kennedy, a tribal member from the Burns Paiute tribe and a field representative for the Oregon-based Ford Family Foundation, began coordinating, developing, and hosting tribal and reservation tours for state and regional funders. I started our conversation by asking Stone why funders have traditionally been hesitant about supporting Native American tribes and organizations.
I think there's a few reasons, right? There's no real firm history in terms of relationships between tribes and private philanthropy, philanthropy with a capital P. I think there are certainly tribes who have had success. They're, based on their capacity, what they're able to accomplish both internally and then their ability to engage outside organizations that aren't the federal government, because so much of their relationship is rooted in those trust obligations to the federal government. A lot of their work is centralized there. So it feels like in many ways, tribes are just beginning to scratch the surface, of seeing what else is possible. One, because I think circumstances necessitate it. But two, I think that there's a lot of history and there's a lot of work that's been conducted even in the last decade, the Native Americans in philanthropy, as they've conducted their own research to recognize this vast inequity around charitable giving to tribes. I think there's a measure of course correcting that foundations of all sorts are attempting to take on. So I think that's an element of it. I also think that there's a reality that tribes are unique, right? Native American people in the United States they're certainly not a racial category, but a unique political status. Sovereignty is a topic that probably requires a whole day or week or months worth of conversation for the uninitiated or for people who may be less familiar with the topic. But I think recognizing that unique dynamic of how tribes are positioned in the landscape, both across nonprofits, both when it comes to formalized partnerships with state agencies, regional governments, the federal government, as I mentioned, there's a lot of nuance there. And there's a lot of nuance that I think can feel daunting to even learn about, let alone engage. And so I think, after a number of years of trying to sort of instill this learning and implement what so many have done just in the field, going out to learn from tribes, learn about their work, their needs, their priorities, I think we're starting to get to a point where tribes are willing to come to the table and foundations are eager to have that conversation as well. So it's definitely exciting, albeit in its infancy in terms of getting support to tribes through charitable giving.
Yeah. Well, and you've taken the lead here in Oregon alongside our friend Tracy Kennedy and others to ensure that foundations get on the ground in reservation communities and with other tribal communities. Talk about that process.
Yeah, that's I think what I've appreciated most about working with Tracy, not even from a collaborative standpoint, but just the fact that there is somebody in this field who has that lived experience, who has that background knowledge, right? We all come from different places, different walks of life. We all have different lived experiences. I don't think this is unique to our community or to any other community out there. But when you show up in spaces that don't feel like they have a lot of individuals, or just the environment doesn't feel like it represents who you are or where you come from, it can present issues, right? Personal issues, working dynamic issues. It can make showing up every day a little bit more tougher. And I think the ability to just pick up the phone and call somebody like Tracy, who has been such a wonderful thought partner, who has been so proactive in wanting to, build momentum within this sphere, within this idea that we can show up and do this work differently. And as you mentioned, I don't necessarily want to coin myself as a leader in this work, but recognizing that it hasn't really been done before in this way that Tracy and I are attempting to do it, it feels very exciting to be on the forefront of a novel process of like, hey, we get to gather a bunch of funders together, and then we get to show up in physical space. We get to have conversations. We get to break bread, share meals. We get to see, very historical sites and places of significance to tribes. We also get to learn about some of the technical aspects of their work. I don't know, it's in many ways it's enriching because I have such an interest in understanding how people, who have that shared background, how they're living in different parts of not only the region but across the nation, across the country, across the globe for that matter, even though we don't have that kind of reach.
Yeah.
So I think, being able to work with Tracy to recognize that there's a lot of work that can be done here, and it's kind of like a playpen that we're figuring out each and every day. How can we make it a little bit more efficient? How can we bring more people in? How can we make it feel welcoming? How can we really, at the crux of our work, build that relationship to tribes so that they feel like they have trusted partners in philanthropy? And so, I think from that standpoint, Tracy and I have been really diligent about being deferential to the tribes about what they would like to see. I think as it pertains to these visits, they're never the same, right? As the age old adage goes, if you visited one tribe, you visited one tribe. And so I've always known across, all of the sectors of work that I've operated in, that tribes are unique and their issues are unique to them. There's dynamics that pertain to them and only them. And as you sort of traverse the landscape, you'll recognize that there's a lot of variance in how to work with tribes, or what their focuses are, what their priorities are. And so just showing up in that way and saying, hey, we're not here to deliver a half-baked plan, but we're actually here to provide something a little bit more substantive in terms of what it is that we want to get to, which is a long-term partnership that's rooted in trust and accountability. I think we've certainly gotten out in the field and have learned a lot, but there's still so much learning to do in terms of allowing ourselves to actually feel like we're institutionalizing this work, for lack of a better term, because I think we both recognize we won't be in these positions forever, but we would like this work to live on long after both of us are gone.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's so helpful. Tracy is a representative of another foundation and a tribal representative here in the state, and yourself with Meyer, being able to serve as that bridge as you create these or the 2-day visits to different reservations where funders have a chance to come in, whether they're program officers or foundation leadership, and it's not as intimidating to say I'm going to make this call myself, or I'm just going to show up on the reservation and try and talk to tribal council as a foundation leader. It's coming in together, and you and Tracy and others are serving as that bridge for folks during those visits, which I think is a real gift to the philanthropic community, and just like you're saying, building long-term relationships and connections for funders and for tribal members and tribal council leaders.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I can't underscore that enough. I've actually had the opportunity, I've had the opportunity to go on many of these visits and these excursions to visit tribes across the region. And, in certain respects or in certain instances, Meyer's leadership has actually shown up alongside me. So whether it's our CEO Toya or our Vice President Kim, or we're actually leading a group of trustees as well as other staff down to Coquel next month for a board meeting that's coupled with a visit to the Coquel tribe to learn some of their practices and just to kind of learn about some of their work and what they're undertaking at the moment. To have Meyer leadership show up in that way, it means the world to me. And it also makes all the difference in moving this work forward, recognizing that when you're meeting with tribal leadership, it's incredibly important for the tribe to also see, leadership across the table, to show that there's respect and that there's value in this engagement. And so, like I said, having that backing from my organization from the top down has really, really only served this work in a positive way. But to your point, I think it's also, there is an aspect of nerves, right? There's always a dis-ease, if you will, in terms of meeting new people. And that can happen on the first day of school as a kindergartner. It can happen in your first real adult job, right? It
Right.
happens at many points in all of our lives. And, I think something that I'm always trying to carry with me in this work are the lessons that I learned from my family and where I come from. I think looking back, every summer I would go to, I'd go back home to North Dakota to spend the summers on the Fort Berthold Reservation with my grandparents and my cousins. And it was a time in my life that is incredibly foundational to who I am today in every way conceivable, right? Like in every way that I am who I am has been informed by my experiences as a child on the reservation. And one of those experiences was actually spending time at our tribal museum just off the Missouri River, west of Newtown, North Dakota. There would be summer mornings where I would get up bright and early and I would drive the 17 miles down the road with my grandma, and we would go into the museum. And she was retired from the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs at that point, but she was also still working part-time as a curator and director for our tribal museum, because for her, a valuable lesson that she took from her ancestors and from our ancestors, and one that she passed down, was like, our history matters and people's history matters, because where we come from is not to be minimized. It's who we are. It's how we walk in this world. It really informs every decision that we make every single day of our lives. And I think, recognizing that, she was always very excited to share that history, not only with her grandchildren and her family, but also people who were just curious, like people that wanted to show up and wanted to know more. And so I remember being in that museum as a small child, right, 6, 7, 8 years old, just sitting in the back, right, back office. I might be drawing on papers or playing with whatever blocks or Legos were available to me at that point. And there would just be groups coming in, every day, not super frequently. I don't know if you've ever been to rural North Dakota, but there's not a whole lot of travel, or I guess there's not a whole lot of people going through at any given hour. But you would have individuals and you would have groups, individuals from all walks of life coming through. You would have tourist groups from Norway. You would have groups from, indigenous groups from India wanting to learn about practices. You would have students from San Jose University doing field studies on indigenous tribes across North America. Like you would have all of these different people sort of moving about this land. And for whatever reason, they would find our little tribal museum and they would walk in. And, I remember, even though it wasn't necessarily so prominent to me, I remember sort of the discomfort, right? How do you walk into a space like that and sort of ask people like, well, what is this, right? What does this mean? Where does this come from? Who are you? Why is this here? Right? Those can be very vulnerable questions to ask. And I always remembered my grandma sort of responding to those in such a kind, caring, and nurturing way. Like she would never want to create an environment of hostility amongst people who were just curious. And that was so meaningful to me, because I got to see all of these different people become illuminated by what it is that they were learning. And over the years, my grandma just maintained contact with so many individuals who would say, when I was a sophomore at this university, I came through and you taught me, about basket weaving and about what it meant and how it played into some of your customs. Or you talked about the meaning of bison as it relates to your tribe, and that really meant something in terms of like how I now view hunting, or how I view my relationship to certain practices that I didn't necessarily give a second thought about. So you would have all of these branches and all of these sort of tentacles, for lack of a better term, kind of come out of these engagements. And I remember as I started this position at Meyer and these tribal engagements became sort of a pillar of what it is that I was trying to accomplish in this role, I remember going into that first engagement out at Warm Springs and just thinking like, it's okay to ask questions. And if they don't want to share, they don't have to share. But I'm going to operate with that same sort of blissful ignorance that other individuals I've seen in my life show up with and have wonderful results in terms of building their learning and building their knowledge bases of things that they didn't know anything about previously. And so that's always just how I'm trying to operate is, I'm not an expert in any way, shape, or form. There's 574 recognized tribes, federally recognized tribes. I could be off by one or two, across the United States, both here in the contiguous and in Alaska. I'm not an expert on any one of them. I'm certainly not even an expert on my own tribe. I have so much learning to do in that regard, but I'm always willing to learn. I'm willing to take pieces away to just help me not only do my work in this role better at Meyer, but I'm also willing to learn in a way that feels like I'm becoming a more well-rounded person because again, I won't be at Meyer forever, so the learning won't stop once I leave. It's more of a matter of what can I take away while I have the opportunity to do the work that I get to do that is incredibly meaningful to me.
Yeah. And I think that's something that we don't do enough of in philanthropy is meeting with one another on the funder side and sharing and talking about experiences that we've had in community and trying, we always talk about leverage. How do we leverage more dollars for that community or that project or this thing or that thing? And part of the relationship between funders is to get additional dollars, right? How do I ensure that Stone's project will also fund this if we're going to fund it? But part of it is just to have expertise and someone to lean on. Because when you do this job well, it's hard. It's hard to determine who gets what. It's not just an open checkbook to anyone that is interested. There's there's pieces to that and there's boards to contend with and communities that there's so much need. So much need. So to have a network of people that can lift each other up is critical work.
Oh, I couldn't agree more, right? I think I'm sure you could probably find some report or some essay done on the effects of working in isolation and solitude and the impacts that they have on individuals. I'm not that depthful. I don't have all of those technical terms or that expertise to try to convey here. But I think as I mentioned, right, getting the opportunity to work with you and Don and getting the opportunity to work with Tracy, getting the opportunity to work with friends over at, Oregon Community Foundation, reconnecting with people in Seattle who I hadn't seen in many years, right? There's like stepping into this world and having lived in it for 3 years, that network is absolutely necessary to the success of not only us as foundations, but for our partners, right? We need to be able to alleviate the burden of organizations and tribes from, of going to each of us one by one and having the same conversation over and over and over, right? We have this project, we need to get it funded. So I have a meeting with this person I have to tell it to, and then this person and this person. And it's like, here's a novel idea. Why don't we all just gather ourselves up? Let's get in our collective vehicles. Let's drive to wherever these tribes are and let's see firsthand like what it is that we're actually talking about. And you may not find a solution, right? Not all of these things are like it's not to say that hey, we show up and everything is solved and that there's a easy answer at the end of our days together. That's not always the case. But I think it does demonstrate that when there are issues and when there are needs that necessitate a response from not only a group or an individual, but really a collective, it's our responsibility as funders and as human beings to show up in those spaces and to say, hey, like, teach me a little bit more about this. let me make sure that I have the knowledge and that I have a confidence, for lack of a better term, so that when I leave here, I can say, hey, you know what? I was out. I was in the forest with the tribe's natural resource department last week, and they were talking about fire resiliency and fire prevention. And they talk about the how forest fires and wildfires every summer are just getting worse and worse and worse, and how they actually feel like they have a solution based on practices that they've held for many years, and that they're just trying to amplify those efforts and elevate them into a space where there's more eyes on them, right? Like they're up for public consumption, and that they can say, hey, like these things work, and if you give us the opportunity to show you how they work, we can actually find a lot of success in just addressing some of these issues that, again, really necessitate the need for a response. So I think having fun, like having friends at foundations, having people to lean on, having those conversations, getting an application and saying, this is interesting. Oh, it looks like they've already connected with, X foundation. Let me give them a call. Let me hear their firsthand perspective. Those things mean something, right? And they're not to be lost. And I think it's also got to be held sort of in congruence with the reality that we also don't want to wall ourselves off, right, from individuals that we might not know. So I think relationships are great. Relationships make the work go forward, right? They're critical to our roles as funders. And I also want to know, or I want to emphasize that I don't want to wall myself off from somebody who I may not know doing really good work just because I don't know them.
Mhm.
Like, I think it's incredibly important for us to make sure that we're still finding ways to be accessible, or that we're just finding ways to access conversational spaces or convenings when something piques our interest, or when we feel like we have something to contribute to an effort. How do we make sure that we're proactively identifying those opportunities to do so?
Talk about, and you may not be comfortable talking about this, and that's okay. Um, your family's the heart of, you have your own fund. That's sort of what got you started in philanthropy. Like, you have the Mini Dances Fund. Can you talk about that and how it was created?
Yeah, so many dances and Old Dog were my great grandparents on my father's side, through Marilyn Hudson, who was my paternal grandmother. And that was really my first experience with philanthropy, right? Long before I ever actually entered into the professional sphere or even working for Meyer, I had actually, my family had worked to set up a donor advised fund with the Oregon Community Foundation. And we named it in honor of many dances, because there's sort of a pan Indian philosophy of the seven generations rule, right? Meaning that you're always thinking about the three generations that preceded you, how they influence the decisions in the life that you live and that you make, and how the decisions that you're making will ultimately influence the three generations previous to you. And so recognizing that the fund would live on long after my father has passed away, we we felt that the creation of that fund actually started decades and over a century ago, when Many Dances was alive, and how she sort of looked at her life and the decisions that she was making. And I think when you look at the history, when sharing a little bit about the history of my family, it's no different than any other Native family in this country. We were certainly impacted by colonization, by forced assimilation, erasure, all of those unfortunate realities. Like, they've had an impact on my family in some way, shape, or form. And I think at the time, as they were happening, Many Dances and Old Dog had to really sort of look at the decisions that they were making, that they weren't really afforded a lot of time to make. And they had to quickly assess and analyze, what does this mean for us? Not only us, but our children, our children's children, our great grandchildren, the generations that we won't ever come into contact with physically, like how are how are we making decisions so that we're doing our best to benefit people that we won't ever meet? And I think that's that certainly has sort of that thinking and knowing that history and understanding that has been a a pillar of my own giving philosophy, or my philosophy around what philanthropy even is or should be, right? And I think, I recognize, like, hey, not everything always meets the mark, right? People don't always achieve every bit of work that they set out to achieve, myself included. We're not perfect, we're humans, we're flawed. But I think that doing this work and operating in the systems that we live in, I am constantly holding the fact that I'm trying to achieve things that I will never reap the benefits of. Like, I have to be willing to show up and to invest in systems work and to invest in future generations, as I mentioned previously, like always reinvesting in future generations because I was the beneficiary of that kind of thinking. Like, always holding that in high regard, I recognize that, like, I'm doing stuff I won't necessarily benefit from, and that not only is that okay with me, but it's really elemental to sort of how I think about giving in the first place, right? People think you can think about it as tax write-offs. You can think about it as just doing good things. You can think about keeping in alignment with your beliefs, or how look at the world that you want to live in, whether it's based on a number or myriad of factors. But at the end of the day, like, I think the commonality is that we're trying to support things that we ourselves are not going to benefit from, and I think that's pivotal in terms of actually moving the needle forward and trying to build a better world that we can all comfortably and safely live in, with access to the basic things that we need every day. Like, I'm very fortunate to live a life of privilege based on the decisions that many dances and so many of my ancestors before her made. And so, while I certainly love my life and enjoy it, I'm always trying to remember that the day that I am no longer here, I want to make sure that my future generations will also have the benefit of living a life that they truly enjoy. Because at the end of the day, like, that's what we're doing. We're trying to make people's lives better. It's not that complicated. We love to make it complicated through different systems and through different setups and through different sort of how we define our own successes, both as individual people and as a collective. But really, we're just working to make people's lives better. And so that's sort of been always my attachment to this role and this work. And, very grateful that Meyer not only gives me the opportunity to do it, but that Meyer also, like, backs me to do it with my community and with people that mean the world to me, and with a community that hasn't always been recognized in philanthropy. Like, I'm forever grateful for Meyer to give me this opportunity, because I've always said, like, if I left my job tomorrow, I would still have such an immense amount of respect and just gratitude for the organization for giving me the platform to do what I do.
And I think a big part of that is the ability to story share. What makes you really good at your role is your ability to share those stories from an authentic point of view, but also that inspires others to give and to understand. I have this conversation around fundraising a lot because I used to be a fundraiser many years ago, where people would be, I hate fundraising, I hate asking for money. I could write a grant, but I couldn't go up to somebody and ask for money. And I think what's really interesting is the people that are really good fundraisers don't ask for money. They tell you a story, and they're passionate about the project that they care about. And that ends up with the person they're talking to going, "That's really great. What do you need? What are the things that are happening there?" And it's like, "Oh, you know what we really need? a freezer for the wild game that we catch, and to be able to distribute to the community. And it doesn't become an ask. It becomes creating this group of passionate people. And you have such a gift to be able to tell those stories and to say you should come and just listen. You should get to know these folks. This is You'll learn, you'll step in that world, in that space, and be changed.
Yeah, right. I think one, you're very kind with your words, because I definitely don't necessarily think of myself as having any discernible skills with this work, other than what you mentioned, which I don't necessarily think of as skillful as all. Right? Like I don't think of that as skillful work per se. I think that sometimes we can get bogged down, and I've had this happen in previous positions. I've had this happen in school. Like, we have to make everything neat and tidy so that we're not feeling like we're wasting people's time, that we're people are busy in so many different ways, and people have families and they have children and they have careers and they have different pursuits and they volunteer over there. And if I ask for this meeting, I better be able to fill up all 4 or 5 hours of it, because if I'm going to take that time, I better make it useful. And I think what that starts to broach a space of being transactional, which is so antithetical to indigenous values, right? Like, yes, sometimes the transaction is there because it necessitates that, but prior to the transaction, there's a lot of getting to know you. There's a lot of foundation setting that I think can often be overlooked. And I've had this happen. Like I've said, I've been in this world when I've done engagements, with previous universities that I've attended. I've had these experiences in previous positions, both with the city, with the feds. I think even with these tribal funder tours that Tracy and I help organize on behalf of Meyer and the Ford Family Foundation, like, other foundations have approached us and sort of asked questions in the vein of, well, you know, I work in environment or place-based work, or I do children, youth, and families work, and this is of interest to me, but I don't know much about this tribe. Like, what are we going to talk about? What's the agenda, right? Like,
Mhm.
a very linear sort of mindset, or a very linear way of thinking, if you will. And I don't begrudge that. I know that's a reality for many different people based on where we exist in this ecosystem. But I oversimplify it to a point that I think it can almost be sort of confounding to people. It's like, well, so you organize all these people and you get everybody out to these spaces and we all spend the night and we get big groups of people together, and 30 or 40 of us, and half of the tribe and half from foundations and maybe a couple nonprofit representatives and elders. And then you go out and you talk about their history, or you, you talk about their families. Like, I don't know. I've been in spaces where, I'm sitting next to a tribal council member or an elder, and just sort of catching up with them about life. Like, how's the family? Oh, your niece graduated. Congratulations. Like, she's doing STEM work. That's amazing. Oh, like, she's now trying to do soil health work in New Mexico. Oh, that's great. Like, oh, and now you're leading a basket weaving class, or you're doing something, sort of, you're carving a canoe with youth, and then you're going to lead a canoe journey this summer. That's really cool. And then I've had people sort of lean over to me and say, like, this is great sort of relationship building, but it's like, when do we get to the actual work? And I've always sort of loved that moment of, telling them, or illustrating. I'm like, oh, this is the work, right? Like, when we get to the point of actually funding something, I mean, you and I have had this conversation many times before. Like, we have the easiest jobs in the world. Like, we get to give out money for really cool work, and then we get to watch people on the ground go achieve wonderful things for their loved ones, for the people that they see and interact with every day, to make their communities just a little bit better. And I think for us, like, we don't necessarily need to overcomplicate what it is that we do as funders. Like, we get to show up, we get to learn about the work, and then we get to do our best to make recommendations and support it as much as we can, right? When there's that alignment. And there's all those different things that sort of, maybe don't allow us to always, as I mentioned earlier, fund every single thing that we want to fund. Like, there's limitations to our work. I recognize that. But I also think if you're able to shoot the breeze and to have that conversation with those people and to just sort of build that rapport, to, maybe go out and have an iced tea with them after the workday's over. Like if you can, hang out on a sunny patio somewhere and just continue that conversation, then when it gets to the time where you actually need to provide a grant for virtual fencing work that supports first foods regeneration, it's like, great, I can call this person up, have this conversation, get the information I need, and then sort of do the process work that comes with it. But that's not done. The process work that comes with it is not done in those collective spaces. Like those collective spaces are meant to be pure in a way, right? They're meant to be the space where people can come together as people and express that vulnerability, like express enthusiasm. Also, for what it's worth, like express frustrations, right? Like say, like, hey, this has happened previously, and I didn't like this, or like, I used to work with this person, or when I worked with this group previously, or, maybe there was another person who worked at this foundation before you who I really didn't like. It's like, sure, you can tell me that. Again, I come from the feds, and like I come from government. I'm used to getting yelled at. Like that's that is really the least of my concerns. So, allowing people to feel like they can show up and have that, even if it's for an hour, like it goes so far in actually um, finding success in this work in the way that I define it for myself.
Mm. I want to switch gears briefly and talk about your role as a champion for Native journalism and your role on the board for Underscore. Um, can you talk about journalism and its importance in Native communities?
Absolutely. Again, where do I begin? I think getting the opportunity to serve Underscore in the way that I do, it can't be understated what it means, because I think it speaks to me as a whole person, right? I think when you talk about Indigenous journalism, or you talk about journalism in Indigenous communities, for a long time it was very narrow, right? If there were any stories coming out of tribal communities, reservation communities, they're always rooted in some sort of lens of inequity or impoverishment. It was, these people are suffering, like look at them suffer. And if it wasn't those kinds of stories, it was nothing at all, right? We always talk about this concept, me and some of the staff with Underscore, about like parachute journalism, and people sort of, reporters dropping in and extracting a story and then immediately leaving and showing that story to the world as an expose, when really there isn't that trust, that confidence. People, I mean, Native people have been burned by that before. And that's, certainly a contributing factor as to why they can be reserved when it comes to engaging people that they don't know, right? Even if they do show up with the purest of intentions. And so, working with Underscore, I think slowly but surely we're trying to change that narrative, that not only can journalism operate differently, and not only can journalists do work differently in tribal communities than what's been done before, we can also recognize that there's stories of prosperity, and there's stories of persistence, and there's stories of celebration, and things that deserve to be commended. And there's also, there's measures of accountability that can be put forth, right? Like journalism is meant to keep people accountable. It's meant to sort of be a check and a balance on the powers that be, and make sure that people who don't always have the power are not squished by those who do, right? There are many people in tribal communities who have perpetuated harms, that have adversely affected their communities, right? Like Native people are not a monolith. They are, they're not homogenous in thought. They're diverse in their perspectives, and for better or for worse, it's helpful to sort of show that to the world, to show that there is that diversity even in communities that are incredibly tight knit. And I think even more so, right, relating back to Underscore, it's a publication that seeks to elevate stories for people who, A, don't necessarily have that knowledge or have those access points to these communities, but it's also meant to be a grounding mechanism for individuals that live far and away from their homelands, right? And that's myself. My mom and my dad both left the reservation in adolescence because they wanted to provide their children, me and my brothers, opportunities for prosperity that aren't necessarily available on the reservation. And I think one, I would say that in many ways they achieved that. They achieved that goal in spades. And yet a reality of that is that you also grow up sort of feeling disconnected, for lack of a better term, right? You grow up in a community, or you grow up in ways that where you sort of see a culture, or a culture that is inherent to you. It's where you come from, but then you exist physically in a space that doesn't always represent that culture. And media is a big part of that, right? Media is a big part of how we belong, where it is we belong, right? Like, how do we cultivate a sense of belonging? And so, growing up in Portland and living thousands of miles away from Fort Berthold, getting the opportunity to read a publication that elevates the stories of tribal communities within this region so that people can find that connectivity, that it's like, oh, there are people here and they're doing this really cool work and they're doing these things that I know my community to be doing back home. Like, that means something. That means something to me. It means something to community. And it means something to the people who, like I said, don't always have those strong connections because, since its conception, Underscore has had massive success in terms of just building progress and amplifying those stories and elevating issues specific to Indian country that are meaningful. And to just be a small piece of that, it really is something that I take a lot of pride in.
If folks want to start work in Indian country, what's the first step?
Ooh, the $1 million question, right? Again, if I'm ever to write a pamphlet or a booklet one day on Indian Country Engagement 101, that's probably the first page of like, well, what do you do, right? And I don't necessarily know that there's always a straightforward answer to that, right? I think, as I mentioned previously, it really depends where you're at, what it is you're trying to do, right? And I think if you were to real if I were to answer that question honestly for somebody who was asking it, right, how do I sincerely begin to work in Indian country having no previous knowledge or engagement, to this point? What should I do? I would ask them, to ask themselves those questions, like, where are you at? What are you doing? What are you trying to accomplish? Who are you talking to? Why are you doing what it is that you're doing, right? And I don't say those sort of like I don't mean to be esoteric, but I think I ask those questions honestly because I think people do need to sort of recognize that to answer those questions, if they get back to that point of, well, I'm just trying to accomplish this, or I'm just trying to get feedback on this survey, or I have this thing and I want, I want an answer from a tribal representative. I want to be able to quote a native person in my story. Working in Indian country probably isn't for you, right? One, because they're not going to have whole lot of success that way. Like, from my experience, Native people can smell that stuff from a mile away, and they will not engage it, right? They will not waste their time with somebody who just wants to check the box for whatever reason it is. But if you do have sort of long-term intentions and you do recognize that it's like, well, it's hard for me to even define what it is that I'm trying to do, but I'm curious. I'm I'm inquisitive, not from a place of skepticism, but from curiosity, right? Like, I want to know more about this group of people. Like, they work on this, they exist next to this massive body of water, and I want to know what they think. Like, how do they conceptualize this water? Like, what is their relationship to it? Are there intersections where we could potentially have, not even collaborate, but just have conversations? Do Are the things that I'm talking about and the things that I'm thinking about, are they also thinking and talking about those things? And I think if you start to sort of peel back that onion and recognize you don't necessarily have those clear answers, but yet your interest hasn't waned, I think that's a great place to enter from, right? I've talked about this with, one of your colleagues, Rebecca, like, when sort of like starting this journey, it's like, well, just showing up, right? Like I didn't have any other goal but to just show up. And if they had time to talk to me, that would be great. And if they didn't, no hard feelings. But I'm willing to make that drive, that 1 hour drive, that 2 hour drive, that 4 hour drive. Like I'm willing to do that just to sit in space. And if something comes up, then I want to make sure that I'm responding appropriately and jumping at the bit, but that I'm not doing it in a way to just satisfy some metric that somebody else has placed upon me or that I've placed upon myself. And so I think going into Indian country, working with tribes, I think persistence and a willingness to learn, a willingness to make mistakes. I can't say that there's a process or even a protocol, right? I couldn't write it down on steps, but if I couldn't write it down in steps, but if you hold those tenets close to your heart, you will find success in this work. And it does not matter where you come from, because I think, again, you don't need to be Indian to support Indian country. You don't need to be native to work in native communities. Like they're willing to embrace people who show up with that honesty in their heart because they see it. And it doesn't matter what color your skin is, what's your race, your gender, your, ethnic background, like none of that matters. If you show up with an honesty and a purity of heart, like that goes a long way.
Yeah. And being curious and awkward, comfortable being curious and awkward, right?
Oh, well, I'm always curious and awkward. So those things are just second nature.
It's always so great to talk to you. I appreciate how you show up in this work. I appreciate who you are as a human, who you are in philanthropy. Your voice is so strong and so important in this work. So thank you for being willing to share it and being willing to share a little bit today with all of us.
Thanks for listening to me yammer, and likewise, I appreciate the opportunity. This really was this is wonderful. So thank you.
Just do the work. Just show up and do the work. Be persistent. Be in community. Visiting, as all rural people know, is the work. Go to those communities and build those relationships, because without them, nothing gets done. Prioritize small talk and getting a chance to hear someone's life story, those meandering conversations. Don't feel like you have to just talk shop, especially when you show up in a Native American community or a rural one, for that matter. I met Stone's dad several years ago as we were expanding our work, and that was one of the questions that I asked him was, how do I start doing this work in Native communities? And he told me, you're gonna screw it up. So get comfortable in that place. Know that it's okay if you show up with an open heart, with an idea that you just want to be helpful and be supportive and do the best that you can, and know that you're gonna screw it up. But that's okay. Ask the questions from a place of curiosity and respect. And that's how we can change philanthropy when it starts to happen more in Native communities. Thanks for listening. Check out fundingrural.com for resources and other information.